The first German prisoners of war to set foot on American soil in 1943 carried with them the arrogance of the Reich and the bitterness of defeat. These men, mostly veterans of the Afrika Korps, expected harsh treatment, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, what awaited them would shatter not only their assumptions about the United States, but also the very foundations of Nazi propaganda they had believed in. When the trains pulled into Mexia, Texas, the prisoners looked out through the barred windows and saw something that made no sense. A sprawling camp, built in perfect order, completed in only 3 months, with barracks neatly lined, water towers in place, and electric lights glowing at night. One German lieutenant later recalled, "In Germany, such a facility would have taken years to construct, even with forced labor. Here, it seemed America built it as easily as one might assemble a child's toy." Inside the wire, they found conditions unimaginable compared to the battlefields of North Africa or the bombed cities of the Reich. Each barack was heated in winter, fitted with electric lights, and supplied with running water. Prisoners received mattresses, blankets, and uniforms suitable for the climate. The Geneva Convention regulations were not only followed, but often exceeded. For men who had been trained to believe America was weak, divided, and racially degenerate, this order and abundance struck harder than any battlefield defeat. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, described his astonishment upon being assigned to the camp hospital. He found X-ray machines, sterilization equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies unavailable in Germany since 1941. Most shocking of all was the presence of penicillin, a drug that in the Reich was only a whispered rumor. They used it freely, even for prisoners with minor infections, Bauer later testified. German soldiers were dying for lack of sulfur drugs, yet here the Americans gave their most advanced medicine to their enemies without hesitation. But it was in the camp kitchens that the first real blow to Nazi illusions was delivered. Assigned to cooking duty, Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, discovered equipment that seemed more at home in a palace than a prison. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for thousands. The daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, and vegetables, luxuries unseen in Germany since 1939. For many, the sight of white bread, served daily and in excess, was more shocking than the sight of American tanks. Krebs wrote bitterly in his diary, "Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Perfectly good bread, meat, and milk, all discarded because regulations required 10% extra to be prepared. I wept as I threw it into the garbage." In Germany, children begged in the streets for crusts, and here the enemy discards abundance as waste. What these men were witnessing, without realizing it, was the first glimpse of America's true secret weapon, not its armies or its bombers, but its unmatched capacity to produce. For now, they were simply shocked. They had come expecting cruelty and scarcity, but they were confronted instead with prosperity and order. The realization had only begun, but already the seeds of doubt were planted. If this was how America treated its enemies, what kind of life did it give its own people? When the first work details were organized in late 1943, few German prisoners understood what awaited them beyond the camp fences. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed they would be sent to build roads under armed guard. Others imagined chain gangs breaking rocks in the sun. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks, given boxed lunches, and driven without blindfolds through the open countryside of Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and the Deep South. It was on those journeys that the true scale of America began to unfold before their eyes. Endless fields of corn stretched toward the horizon. Farmhouses stood sturdy and painted, and barns were filled with modern machinery unlike anything they had seen back home. The prisoners could not look away. Unteroffizier Herbert Lang, assigned to a cotton gin near Houston, remembered the moment his world shifted. "In my village," he wrote years later, "an entire season's work of families and neighbors might yield a modest harvest, dragged by hand and mule. In Texas, a single machine, powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, processed more cotton in 1 hour than we could handle in a month." The farmer was not nobility, not a party man, just an ordinary citizen. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, even 2 cars. His workers, including the Negroes, carried lunchboxes filled with more food than German workers saw in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. The shock was not just in the abundance, but in its equality. Nazi ideology had trained these men to believe prosperity belonged only to the few, the party elite, the officers, the industrialists. Yet here in America, ordinary farmers lived with a comfort and security that rivaled the aristocracy of Europe. For the first time, cracks appeared in the certainty of German superiority. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields that seemed to stretch forever. There, Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann encountered another revelation. A 16-year-old farm boy casually operated a tractor worth more than his father's entire lifetime earnings. When Hoffmann expressed disbelief, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good model. His father was waiting on a new machine from John Deere, one that would be faster, stronger, and better. At that moment, Hoffmann later confessed, "I realized Germany could not win. We fought with rifles from the last war, with horses pulling our supply wagons. And here even the children commanded machines of impossible power. Their farms produced yields we could only dream of, 60 bushels of wheat per acre, while our best land produced barely half. It was as if the very soil of America had conspired with its machines to overwhelm us." This revelation repeated itself across the American heartland. Every prisoner assigned to agricultural work witnessed the same truth: abundance not as privilege, but as standard. Whether in Kansas wheat fields, Texas cotton rows, or Iowa corn country, the pattern was the same. Mechanization, electricity, and efficiency turned labor into production on a scale beyond German imagination. The lessons extended beyond agriculture. As the labor shortage deepened, prisoners were sent into sawmills, canning plants, and small factories, always under the Geneva Convention rule that forbade direct war work. What they found there stripped away the last illusions instilled by Nazi propaganda. At a sawmill in Arkansas, prisoners watched automated conveyors move logs with minimal human effort, entire trees cut into usable planks in minutes. In a Kansas food plant, they witnessed production lines turning out canned goods by the thousands each day. Even these industries, not directly tied to the war effort, displayed a level of organization and productivity that dwarfed anything in the Reich. Lieutenant Karl Meissner, captured in Tunisia, recalled his shock at one such visit. "I thought I understood American propaganda when it spoke of the arsenal of democracy. But when I saw with my own eyes a factory that made nothing but bottle caps, hundreds of thousands a day, more than all of Germany might need in a year, I understood. If they could dedicate entire factories to something so trivial, how limitless must their true war production have been? We Germans struggled for bullets, spare parts, even boots. America drowned in abundance." These encounters, spread across thousands of prisoners and dozens of states, carried a devastating psychological effect. No Allied leaflet, no BBC broadcast, no propaganda film could have matched the silent evidence of a combined harvester in motion, or the sight of grocery stores with parking lots filled with cars, every shelf stocked with goods, even in wartime. The Reich had promised its soldiers that America was a nation of mongrels, weak and incapable, propped up only by Jewish financiers and corrupt politicians. Yet the reality, witnessed firsthand, was an industrial colossus fueled not by tyranny, but by ordinary citizens empowered with tools, knowledge, and freedom. What stunned the prisoners most was not simply the wealth, but the confidence. American farmers and workers spoke casually of yields, machines, and improvements as if progress were inevitable. There was no fear of shortage, no whispered despair, only an unshakable belief that tomorrow would be better than today. For men who had grown up in the shadow of scarcity and propaganda, this optimism was as shocking as the machinery itself. Some resisted the implications. Hardline Nazis dismissed what they saw as trickery, staged for their benefit. But for most, the evidence was overwhelming. They had seen it with their own eyes, touched it with their hands, and even eaten from its surplus. By the winter of 1943, conversations in the barracks shifted. The pride of conquest gave way to silent comparisons. The rationed bread of Germany against the discarded loaves of America, the horse-drawn wagons of the Wehrmacht against the tractors of Texas farm boys, the bombed-out factories of the Ruhr against the humming plants of Kansas. One prisoner summarized the change years later. On the battlefield, we thought the Americans fought like amateurs. But when we saw their country, we realized the battlefield was irrelevant. How could we defeat a people who treated abundance as routine? Germany was doomed not because our soldiers lacked courage, but because America possessed a prosperity that was beyond calculation. This was the quiet turning point. The war itself continued to rage across Europe and the Pacific, but for thousands of German prisoners in America, the outcome was no longer in doubt. They had seen the engine that powered the Allied armies, and they understood that no amount of discipline or ideology could compensate for such overwhelming capacity. The trucks rolled back into camp each evening, carrying weary men with dirt on their hands and new questions in their minds. What kind of nation could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its allies? What kind of system allowed farmers to live better than German officers? And what kind of future awaited a world shaped by such abundance? The answers were not yet clear, but the seeds had been planted. What had begun as curiosity was turning into revelation, and what these men had seen in the American heartland would linger long after the war ended. 4 German soldiers captured in North Africa. The train rides that carried them into the American interior were unforgettable. Behind the barbed wire, they expected punishment, perhaps starvation, certainly humiliation. Yet what awaited them in camps across Texas, Louisiana, Iowa, and dozens of other states was something few could have imagined: order, abundance, and, most shockingly, respect. Each camp was built with astonishing speed, sometimes in less than 3 months. Rows of wooden barracks lined up like military formations, surrounded by double fences and watchtowers. Inside, however, conditions bore little resemblance to the prisons the Nazis maintained in Europe. Every prisoner received a bunk with clean bedding, blankets sufficient for the season, and access to hot showers. Luxuries many had not known even as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Corporal Otto Reinecke recalled his first night in Texas. "I was prepared for beatings, for sleeping in straw like animals. Instead, I lay in a bed with a mattress, with sheets that smelled of soap. I had a full stomach, and the lights worked with a simple switch on the wall. I could hardly believe it. I thought perhaps they were softening us before harsher treatment began. But it was not so. It was simply normal for them. The meals shocked the prisoners most of all. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, fruit, milk, and coffee, served not once, but every morning. At lunch, trays overflowed with meat, vegetables, and bread so fresh that prisoners whispered it must have been baked for them alone. Supper brought stews, potatoes, or even pasta dishes introduced by Italian-American cooks. For men who had grown accustomed to watery cabbage soup and meager rations of black bread, the sheer quantity of food was bewildering. Sergeant Wilhelm Gartner described the experience. "I sat with my tray and looked at the food. There was more meat there than my family saw in a week. When I finished, a guard told me I could go back for more. I thought it was a trick, but no, it was true. We prisoners of war, captured soldiers of Hitler, ate better than the civilians of Germany." Not all food went to the table. America's agricultural surpluses were so vast that fruit with blemishes was discarded, fields were plowed under to stabilize prices, and surplus milk was poured away. German prisoners who had grown up in hunger-ridden villages could scarcely comprehend such waste. Some pleaded with guards to let them send the excess to their families back home. The guards, sympathetic, explained that it was impossible. To the Germans, it was a revelation. America had so much that it could destroy food and still remain secure. Inside the camps, order was maintained not through cruelty but through structure. The Geneva Convention was scrupulously followed. Prisoners organized their own barracks leadership, elected spokesmen, and even ran camp newspapers printed with ink and presses provided by the Americans. Soccer leagues formed quickly, fields were marked out, uniforms improvised, and matches drew hundreds of spectators, both prisoners and guards. Work details occupied much of the day. Prisoners were sent to harvest crops, cut lumber, or perform maintenance, earning small wages credited to their accounts. With these, they could purchase items at camp canteens: tobacco, candy, stationery, even beer in some places. Letters home were encouraged, not censored beyond basic security. The Red Cross facilitated exchanges, and packages occasionally arrived with clothes or small comforts. To men indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, this treatment was deeply unsettling. They had been told Americans were brutal, weak, decadent, incapable of discipline. Instead, they found themselves treated with a dignity that undermined every lesson drummed into them by party propaganda. Lieutenant Erich Kruger, captured in Tunisia, wrote years later, "The Americans made a distinction that our leaders never understood. They said they fought Hitler, not Germany. At first we thought this was propaganda. But when our wives and children received food parcels from American church groups, when our sick were treated in their hospitals, when suicides were met with counseling instead of punishment, we realized it was true. They hated Nazism, but they did not hate us." The medical care alone was enough to shake convictions. Prisoners with injuries or illnesses were taken to American hospitals, where German doctors often worked alongside American staff, gaining access to equipment unavailable even to elite patients back home. Men suffering from depression or trauma were not punished, but given therapy. For soldiers raised in a system where weakness was despised, this humanity was baffling. Feldwebel Hans Botcher recalled, "I saw a man who tried to hang himself. In Germany, he would have been beaten or executed for cowardice. Here, the Americans cut him down, sent him to a doctor, and treated him with kindness. They spoke of mental wounds as if they were real wounds. I had never seen such a thing. It seemed to me then that they were strong enough to show mercy, and I began to doubt everything I had been told." Even leisure time carried lessons. Camp libraries were stocked with thousands of books, from technical manuals to American novels. Movies were screened weekly, some showing the vast landscapes of the United States, others depicting ordinary American life. German soldiers who had grown up on Nazi propaganda reels watched, open-mouthed, as images of American cities, highways, and factories flickered on the screen. What unsettled them most was not American power, but American normalcy. They saw men and women working together, black and white citizens shopping in the same stores, immigrant families thriving without persecution. For men indoctrinated in racial hierarchy, these images were shocking, even destabilizing. Slowly, discussions in the barracks began to shift from military matters to social questions. Was democracy truly possible? Could a nation thrive without dictatorship? Could prosperity be shared so widely? The effect was not immediate, nor was it uniform. Some prisoners clung to Nazi beliefs, forming secret groups within the camps. But for many, the weight of evidence was undeniable. Every meal, every paycheck, every respectful interaction chipped away at the certainty with which they had entered captivity. As 1944 turned into 1945, the psychological shift deepened. The Normandy invasion had shown them America's military might. Daily life in the camps showed them something more profound, a society secure enough in its strength to treat even enemies with humanity. One prisoner later summarized it simply: "We entered those camps as conquerors who had failed. We left as men who had seen another way of life and wanted it for our children." The transformation had begun. It was not forged in battle, but in kitchens, hospitals, workshops, and classrooms hidden behind barbed wire. The Germans had been captured by force of arms. But inside America's camps, they were conquered by something far greater, the living evidence of a free society's strength. The fields stretched endlessly before their eyes, golden seas of wheat shimmering under the summer sun, broken only by rows of sturdy tractors rumbling with unrelenting purpose. For the German prisoners, marched past these farmlands under the watchful eyes of guards, it was a sight that left them dumbfounded. Back in Europe, farmland meant sweat, toil, and the backbreaking rhythm of men and beasts tethered together. Here, in America, the land seemed to obey the machines. Acres upon acres of fertile soil were plowed, seeded, and harvested not by hundreds of men, but by a handful of farmers commanding iron giants that worked with a precision that felt almost supernatural. To a prisoner whose memory of farming was tied to horse-drawn plows and weary peasants bent under the weight of hunger and war, the American countryside appeared like something out of a dream. They whispered among themselves, how could a nation feed its soldiers abroad, its citizens at home, and still have silos bursting with surplus? Germany, once confident in its discipline and resourcefulness, now seemed small in comparison to the bounty stretching across this new world. The POW camps themselves became strange classrooms. Many of these men, some of them farmers, carpenters, or machinists in their civilian lives, were put to work in America's fields and factories. They expected hardship, perhaps even cruelty. But instead they found something that unsettled them more. A system where even prisoners could contribute to a nation's abundance, where labor was not driven by desperation, but by an unseen faith in prosperity. They were paid small wages, given food that often surpassed what they had eaten as soldiers, and introduced to methods of farming and production that redefined their understanding of efficiency. It was in these daily labors that the German prisoners began to glimpse the deeper truth behind America's strength. It wasn't just the towering smokestacks of Detroit or the endless assembly lines producing jeeps and planes. It was the very spirit of productivity that permeated everything, from the way a field was tilled to the way a factory was managed. This was not the chaotic, forced efficiency of a war machine held together by fear and orders. It was something far more enduring, something woven into the very fabric of American life. They wrote letters home, though heavily censored, trying to describe what they had seen. Some wrote of barns larger than village halls, of machines that did the work of dozens of men, of stores filled with food even in times of global war. For families back in Germany, these tales must have sounded like exaggerations, perhaps even propaganda. Yet the prisoners knew what their eyes had shown them. This land had resources and systems so vast that the war, for all its destruction, barely dented its capacity to grow. In the evenings, as they sat together in their barracks, the prisoners often discussed the war in hushed tones. Many of them began to realize the truth that had been carefully hidden from them by their leaders. Germany could never outproduce a nation like this. The Reich had prided itself on order, on discipline, on squeezing every drop of effort from its people. Yet here was a society where abundance flowed naturally, where factories and farms seemed to breathe in unison, creating wealth and strength without the lash of fear. The comparison gnawed at them. Some resisted the thought, clinging to the narratives of superiority they had been fed for years. They muttered that American wealth was built on luck, on stolen land, or on resources that any nation could exploit given time. But others, quietly, admitted that there was something different here, something that could not be explained away by chance. It was not just the machines, but the minds that designed them, the culture that encouraged innovation, the openness to ideas that in Germany might have been dismissed or crushed. One evening, a group of POWs assigned to farm duty were taken to a fair in a nearby town, not as guests, but as laborers helping to set up stalls. Yet even from the sidelines, they watched with astonishment. Families strolled freely, children laughing, merchants displaying goods in abundance. There was no fear in the air, no sense of rationing or desperate scarcity. To men who had marched through bombed-out cities, where mothers stood in breadlines and children wore shoes patched beyond recognition, this scene was more shocking than the grandest American factory. Here, in the middle of a world war, ordinary people lived with a freedom and comfort that German propaganda had always insisted was impossible. In those moments, the prisoners began to sense a profound shift within themselves. The war had begun as a contest of weapons, of armies clashing across continents. But here, behind the fences of POW camps, they saw the true battlefield, the ability of a society to create, to provide, to endure. They realized that America's power was not only in its tanks and planes, but in the invisible foundations of its prosperity, its fertile soil, its unyielding machines, its belief that tomorrow could always be made better. Some of the younger prisoners, barely men when they were captured, found themselves dreaming of what life might be like if they could stay in such a place. They whispered to each other about farms where tractors roared instead of horses groaned, about cities lit not by fear, but by opportunity. Others, older and hardened by ideology, shook their heads in silence, unwilling to admit even to themselves that they were moved. But no matter how much they resisted, the impression lingered. They could not unsee the silos filled with grain, the factories humming like living creatures, the shelves and stores stacked high with goods. They could not forget that even in captivity, they had eaten better than many of their families back home. And deep down, beneath the layers of indoctrination and pride, many of them began to understand. America's might was not merely industrial. It was a way of life, one that had the power to reshape even the minds of its enemies. The camp fences, though tall and lined with barbed wire, could not contain what the German prisoners saw beyond them. The sight of bustling towns, of railroads alive with movement, of endless streams of trucks carrying goods in every direction. These glimpses painted a picture more powerful than any weapon. For men who had been taught to see the United States as a land of chaos and weakness, every passing day brought fresh contradictions to the beliefs instilled in them by the Reich. Work assignments had taken many of these prisoners into the heart of American industry. They had stood inside cavernous factories where sparks flew like lightning from the welders' torches, where assembly lines moved with a rhythm so steady it felt as though the machines themselves were alive. They had watched men and women working side by side, each contributing their skill to a greater whole. For some prisoners, the shock was not merely in the scale of production, but in the way ordinary people, civilians, not soldiers, were entrusted with such responsibility. In Germany, authority had been absolute, hierarchy rigid, and mistakes often punished with severity. But here, on American soil, the prisoners observed something astonishing. Workers who spoke freely to their supervisors, women who operated heavy machinery with confidence, foremen who encouraged ideas rather than silencing them. To the Germans, steeped in a culture of obedience, this freedom within the workplace seemed impossible. Yet it was precisely this openness that fueled the innovation and efficiency before their eyes. In the evenings, when the day's labor ended, the prisoners would lie awake on their bunks, staring at the wooden beams above them, replaying what they had seen. One man whispered to another about the sheer number of planes being produced each week, far more than Germany could manage in months. Another muttered about the rail networks that seemed to connect every corner of the country, a web of steel that kept supplies flowing without interruption. Some of them laughed bitterly, recalling the promises of their leaders that German industry was unmatched. Here, in the heart of America, they now knew those words had been hollow. Yet perhaps the most disarming realization came not from machines or factories, but from people. When these prisoners interacted with Americans, farmers, guards, workers, they often encountered kindness instead of cruelty. Not universal, not always, but often enough to plant seeds of doubt in their minds. They had expected scorn, perhaps even vengeance, from a nation their own had tried to conquer. Instead, they were offered food, medical care, and at times, even respect. This treatment unsettled them more than harshness ever could, because it revealed a society that did not need hatred to sustain itself. One prisoner later recalled the day he was given an orange while working in a field. It was a small gesture, a piece of fruit handed over by a young boy curious about the men behind the fence. But for that prisoner, who had not tasted such abundance in years, the moment became unforgettable. He bit into the orange, the sweetness flooding his mouth, and realized with painful clarity that this was what his own people had been denied. Not just food, but the simple sense of possibility that life could be generous. Letters home carried fragments of these revelations, though always cloaked in vague language to slip past censors. "The land here is vast," one man wrote, "and the people have everything they need." Another scrawled a line that would have been dangerous if stated plainly. "The strength of this place is not only in its weapons, but in its freedom." Families receiving these words could only guess at what they meant, but for the men behind the wire, the truth became inescapable. Still, there was resistance within themselves. Pride is not easily surrendered, especially for soldiers who had marched under banners of victory, who had believed they were part of a chosen nation destined to rule. To admit that America had outmatched them not only in battle but in spirit was to confront a wound far deeper than defeat. And so, in whispered arguments in the barracks, some clung fiercely to their old beliefs. They muttered that America's wealth made its people soft, that true strength could only be forged in struggle. Yet even as they spoke, the evidence around them mocked their words. For the younger prisoners, the contrast was harder to ignore. Many of them had grown up in a Germany ravaged by depression and then reshaped by propaganda. Their first encounter with true abundance came not at home, but here, as captives in a foreign land. For these men, America became less an enemy and more an enigma, an idea they could not dismiss. They wondered what might happen if their homeland, once the war was over, could embrace even a fraction of this openness, this capacity to innovate without fear. The guards noticed it too. They watched as the German prisoners, who at first carried themselves with rigid pride, slowly began to change. Their posture softened, their conversations grew less harsh, and their curiosity deepened. When they were given books in the camp libraries, many reached eagerly for English texts, struggling to understand the language of the land that had captured them. When radios played American music, some listened with fascination, their feet unconsciously tapping to rhythms they had never heard before. It was in these subtle shifts that the true victory began to take shape. America had not only captured soldiers, it had captured their imagination. The industrial might that had stunned them was only the surface. Beneath it lay something greater, a society that believed in freedom, in abundance, in the power of individuals to shape their own lives. For men who had been raised in a system of rigid control, this discovery was nothing short of revolutionary. By the time the war began to draw to a close, many German prisoners understood that they would return to a homeland shattered not only by bombs but by lies. And though they dreaded what awaited them, they carried within their hearts the memory of what they had seen here. The factories that hummed like living creatures, the fields that yielded without exhaustion, the people who lived without fear. These images would remain long after the fences had disappeared. And in those memories, in that reluctant admiration, lay the seeds of something far greater than victory. They hinted at the possibility that even enemies, once exposed to the truth of a freer world, could be transformed. When the war finally ended and the gates of the camps swung open, the German prisoners of war began their long journeys home. For many, it was a return to cities reduced to rubble, to families broken by loss, to a nation searching for direction in the ashes of defeat. Yet as they boarded trains and ships bound for Europe, they carried something unexpected with them. Not bitterness, but a vision of what they had witnessed in America. They had arrived in the United States as soldiers of Hitler's Reich, convinced of their nation's superiority and the weakness of the West. They had been taught to see America as a land of chaos, decadence, and ignorance. But behind the barbed wire, through labor in the fields and glimpses into the heart of American factories, they discovered a truth too powerful to ignore. The United States had not only defeated them in battle, it had overwhelmed them with abundance, humbled them with freedom, and disarmed them with humanity. Some prisoners wrote years later that the most lasting memories were not of hardship, but of wonder. They remembered seeing fields stretch beyond the horizon, cultivated with machines that worked tirelessly. They remembered assembly lines producing aircraft and tanks in numbers so vast that even German efficiency paled by comparison. They remembered the libraries in the camps, where books opened new worlds, and the classrooms where they were taught a language they once despised. But most of all, they remembered the kindnesses, large and small, shown by the very people they had once been ordered to destroy. The irony was striking. They had come to America as captives, yet they left with a freedom of the mind that many had never known before. No propaganda, no speech by a general, no victory parade could have reshaped them as profoundly as the simple daily evidence of what a free society could achieve. For the first time, many of these men began to question not only the defeat of their army, but the foundations of the ideology that had guided their lives. As the years passed, the influence of this experience began to ripple across the Atlantic. Former prisoners returned to Germany and became teachers, engineers, writers, and leaders in their communities. They carried with them the memory of America's factories humming with life, of farms feeding millions, of a democracy that worked not because it was imposed from above, but because it was lived by ordinary people. This memory would shape the rebuilding of their homeland, helping to lay the foundations of what became known as the economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s. Historians often write of battles and treaties, of strategies and political decisions. But the transformation of these men is a reminder that history is not made only in the clash of armies or the signing of documents. Sometimes, it is made quietly, in the hearts and minds of those who witness a different way of life and are forever changed by it. The German POWs came to America believing in conquest, and they left believing in cooperation. They had once sworn loyalty to a regime that thrived on fear, yet they left with an understanding of a society that thrived on trust. They had once been soldiers of tyranny, but they returned as reluctant ambassadors of democracy. In the end, their journey was more than a story of captivity. It was a story of transformation. Even decades later, at reunions held in both America and Germany, former prisoners would speak of their time behind the wire not as years lost, but as years that opened their eyes. Some would stand before audiences, their voices trembling with age, and confess that they had learned more about humanity in those camps than in all the years before the war. They would thank the guards who treated them fairly, the farmers who shared meals with them, the children who offered them kindness without understanding the weight of war. And the Americans who listened would realize that victory had come in more than just battles fought overseas. It had come in the quiet triumph of example. Because in the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, nor its tanks, nor its planes, though all of these played their part. Its greatest weapon was its ability to show, beyond any argument, what free people could build when they worked together. The factories, the farms, the railroads, the cities, they stood as monuments not just to industrial might, but to the idea that prosperity could be shared, that dignity could be given even to one's enemies. For the prisoners, the lesson was unmistakable. Their captivity had become their education, their defeat had become their enlightenment. And though they returned to a broken nation, they carried with them seeds of change. Seeds that, once planted in German soil, would grow into one of the most remarkable transformations of the modern age. A defeated nation becoming a partner in peace, an enemy becoming an ally, and a land once consumed by hate becoming a cornerstone of democracy. The story of the German POWs in America is not just a footnote in history. It is a testament to a truth often forgotten, that sometimes the most profound victories are not won through destruction, but through demonstration. That sometimes the surest way to change a heart is not through fear, but through the undeniable power of example. As the last of those men fade into history, their story remains. A story of shock, of revelation, and ultimately, of redemption. They came as enemies. They left as witnesses. And their children would grow up in a world shaped by the lessons they carried home. And so, as we look back on their journey, we are reminded of the enduring power of freedom, of abundance, and of humanity itself. In the end, it was not the weapons of war, but the vision of peace and prosperity that left the deepest mark on their lives. Because sometimes, the greatest way to win a war is not by breaking your enemies, but by showing them a better way to live. And as this chapter of history closes, we are left with one undeniable truth. The greatest victories are not always won on the battlefield, but in the hearts of men. If this story moved you, if it made you see history in a new light, then join us in keeping these forgotten tales alive. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden stories of our past. Because history is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember.